Okay, thank you all so much for joining us. I see the numbers of folks in the, folks are still coming into the Zoom room, so I'm gonna just wait a minute or two until I get started, so we have everybody's with us. All right. I think we'll get started. This Representative Omar needs to leave at 12:45 Eastern time, so I want to not waste any time. First, we're incredibly honored to be joined today by Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. A couple of brief housekeeping notes. There is the chat and the Q&A are both on, but I'm not going to be looking at the chat. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and I will try to get to some of them and ask them myself in the latter half of the conversation. This conversation is being co-sponsored by my newsletter, the Beinart Notebook, and Jewish Currents, and also the Foundation for Middle East Peace. There should be links in the chat to ways to subscribe to these different publications if you're interested. For those folks who are paid subscribers to my newsletter, next Friday, our conversation is going to be with Fida Giris, the author of this beautiful memoir, Stranger in My Own Land, about her family's return to Israel-Palestine after they were allowed to return after the Oslo Accords, a Palestinian family's journey of, and then the week after that, the Palestinian writer Said Kashua, author of the novel Let It Be Morning, the creator of the series Arab Labor, if any of you have watched that, and we're going to be talking about kind of Israeli entertainment about the conflict, and particularly we'll talk a lot about Fauda, which has been getting a lot of attention. Representative Omar, one of the things that really struck me reading through a lot of the transcripts of your work on the House Foreign Affairs Committee was that you seem to approach American foreign policy and think about American foreign policy in a pretty distinct way, compared not just to your Republican colleagues, but even to a lot of your Democratic colleagues. And I'm wondering if you think that's true, and if you might elaborate a little bit on how you see American foreign policy and the ways in which that might be different than some others in Congress.
Well, Peter, thank you for having me, and it's really good to be here with all of you. I do agree with you in some regards. You know, I always say I wanted to get on the Foreign Affairs Committee and ask the questions that I ask because I was that one person that watched the Foreign Affairs Committee and screamed at the TV all these questions I wanted to be asked. And now I get the opportunity to do so. You know, obviously, I'm someone who was born in a country that was engulfed in a civil war, survived that civil war as a young child, was raised by a father and a grandfather that lived in a colonized Somalia that desperately wanted to have a taste of democracy and independence. And I also, you know, lived in a refugee camp, came to the United States, and I think my worldview in the way in which the United States foreign policy is seen by others in its impact, whether it is positive or negative, is very much different than most of my colleagues. And I think that is due to the fact that, you know, I've experienced it and interacted and have seen people be positively and negatively impacted. Most people don't know I would not have survived that refugee camp if it wasn't for the generosity of the American people in programs like USAID and the refugee resettlement, which are programs that are deliberated on that committee. And, you know, much of what happened in the Horn of Africa, and Africa in general, in its struggles for democracy, took place within the context of the Cold War, and so all of those conversations and legacies are things that are very much present for me as I try to do oversight around our foreign policy, try to critique it and analyze it and present a foreign policy vision that I know should be in line with our values. And I always come back to the saying of Martin Luther King, which was, we're not asking for much, we're just asking for what is said on paper. We're a country that sees itself as the oldest democracy in the world and the strongest. We obviously always talk about how we are a beacon of hope. We speak about ourselves as being a country of immigrants, and all of those things oftentimes are lose credibility in the way in which we might conduct our domestic or foreign policy.
You mentioned Africa in particular. I know a lot of your work in particular on the subcommittee has been on the Africa subcommittee. What do you think are some of the kinds of things that might affect the way the United States is seen in different parts of Africa that people in Washington just generally are not aware of? Because this is this thing where you show polls of people around the world who often have very negative views about American foreign policy, and yet to hear people in Washington, you would think that the United States is always promoting freedom and liberty around the world. So what are some of the things that you think folks in Washington don't really understand about the way people in Africa experience U.S. foreign policy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, my like folks like my father, their first interactions or awareness of the United States and its policies came through things like the Peace Corps. Americans showing up in African villages, helping to teach, and that had really positive sentiment, and I think that could be seen as a positive way to cultivate a view of ourselves in the eyes of those that we say we want to help. But my generation and the generation that's younger than me, their interactions with the United States is through defense. And so on the American foreign policy has the 3 Ds, right? Diplomacy, development, and defense. And so when we look at holistically, the Africa program is very much heavy-handed in that defense, and it doesn't allow for movement in many of the countries that are engulfed in conflict for a lot of our diplomats to interact with people. A lot of the development work that we are doing is not something that can be seen and felt. We're not helping build as many schools as I would like. We're not helping build bridges and investing in infrastructure. And so in the involvement that we have, which we like to see it being different than the countries like China or others, to us it feels different, but sometimes to the people on the ground in these countries that I interact with, as I've traveled to many countries in Africa in my time in Congress, people are always asking where is the U.S.? How is the U.S. working to make our lives better?
What do you say to? You mentioned previously the impact of the last Cold War on Somalia. How concerned are you that this a new kind of Cold War with China and Russia is leading the United States to essentially be willing to support very brutal regimes simply in the name of basically keeping them on our side in this geopolitical conflict, which is what we did often so disastrously during the last Cold War.
Yeah, I mean, and I wasn't suggesting that there was a specific impact on Somalia because of the Cold War. I was more talking about regionally with Ethiopia and Somalia and its conflicts. But obviously, when we're looking at things through a strategic lens, sometimes it leads us to supporting governments, as we have in the past, that are not in line, that are not carrying out policies that are in line with the values that we say we hold as a country. If you are, the case in point in Egypt, we have huge problems with human rights violations. There are massive numbers of dissidents that are hauled to jails, that are serving lengthy sentences without any care for their human rights or upholding international law. And we continue to prop it up. We continue to see it as an ally and shy away from holding it accountable. And that sends a message that says this is contradictory to this value of advancing democracy and open society and human rights, when we continue to support regimes like the one in Egypt.
One of the two of the countries that I know that you have expressed a lot of concern about their human rights records are Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And one of the things that I'm really curious about, perhaps because it resonates for those of us who are Jewish critics of Israel, is that you are a proud Muslim, and you are a very, very strong critic of the human rights abuses of particularly Saudi Arabia, which it claims to have a certain religious authority because of the cities and holy sites that exist within Saudi Arabia. I'm wondering, what is that like for you as one of the very, very few Muslims in Congress to be such an open critic of a very prominent and powerful Muslim regime?
It's not easy. Yeah, alhamdulillah, I am Muslim. I'm proud to be that. I think it is important to hold folks accountable, regardless of whether they hold any sort of reference for you personally or in regards to your faith. In any of those cases, you have to be principled in the things that you say you value and you care about. For me, I value people and I value their rights, their ability to exist as a full human being, and their right to criticize their government. The Saudis, in many ways, not only have they waged an unjust war with the coalition, with our support here in the United States, in Yemen, which is one of the most populated countries in the Middle East and the poorest country in the Middle East. We've watched them bomb bridges, we've watched them bomb schools, we've watched them bomb clinics. These are all violations of international law. In many regards, people would consider that war crimes, and there is really no accountability of what's happening there. They also arrest dissidents unilaterally without even putting them through a legal system that could even be considered just. They arrest people for tweets. There is a gentleman who's from Florida who has been in jail for 15 years for a tweet in Saudi Arabia. We know their long history of treating women as second-class citizens. Obviously, they've made some adjustments there. We know their treatment of Muslim minority sects. We know their denials of visas to go to Hajj, which is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and to host the holiest site that most Muslims are required, if they can, to go to, and deny people because they come from certain countries, or you don't think they're Muslim enough. In your book, to me, as somebody who's Muslim and human, it just feels wrong to not constantly speak on it and speak as loud as I can.
You talked about,
but I will say
yeah.
that for my Arab-speaking relatives, whether it's my brothers or my late father, it was quite painful, because the way in which I am talked about in Saudi-led media really can't even be compared to Fox News. I mean, it's really abhorrent, and so there's a price in the community, in the Muslim community at large, that I pay for being outspoken about their human rights violations, more so than any other country.
I mean, it seems to me that is, if it's, to me, this is part of a kind of authoritarian axis that exists now, in which you have authoritarian Arab regimes that are essentially working kind of as allies of Israel, and trying, both in their own ways, to insulate all of their regimes from human rights criticism. And often, as you say, just as Israel will accuse people of being anti-Semitic for supporting Palestinian rights, the Muslim regimes will accuse people of being anti-Muslim for supporting the rights of people who are oppressed by a Muslim regime. So it leads me to think, and you have had to deal with these issues so much. How is it possible to create alliances in the United States across religious lines of Muslims and Jews and Christians and other people to fight for human rights in general, against all regimes that are violating human rights, especially those that are doing so with American money and American weapons, in opposition to this kind of weird ecumenical intra-religious authoritarian axis that is actually pushing back the other way?
And I say the alliances exist. There are many Jewish organizations that fight for human rights that I've worked with, that have supported me throughout my congressional career. There are many Muslim, Christian, and non-faith groups that care about advancing human rights. I think, we seem to think we don't wield as much power and influence, but we do. There are a growing number of members of Congress. In this last election, so many of us were threatened, and many of us survived. I think we lost one member in Michigan to this fight, Andy Levin, my beloved friend, who I sat with both on the Ed and Labor Committee and on the Foreign Affairs Committee, who is a close ally of myself and Rashida Tlaib and others. But I think that the pendulum always swings back and forth. I think it is important for us to continue to be principled, for us to continue to be brave, and for us to continue to remember that descending here in the United States doesn't cost as much as descending in these countries that we are trying to hold accountable. Many of the people who descend in those countries face jail time and oftentimes lose their lives, oftentimes have their families threatened. So what we deal with and the political liabilities that we might have, to me, is nothing compared to anything else, and it's not worth being silenced. It's not worth being silent over.
When you think about, but there are many members of Congress, most members of Congress, who certainly when it comes to Palestinian rights are silent, or one could say worse, in the sense that they're enthusiastic supporters of essentially of human rights abuses against Palestinians and American complicity in those. How far away do you think we are from being able to move U.S. foreign policy on Israel-Palestine towards something that actually doesn't make the U.S. as complicit in these human rights abuses? How much of the obstacle is people's lack of knowledge, and how much of the obstacle is just the political realities that people feel are too daunting for them?
I mean, I would say, there are a lot of people, obviously, who are politically motivated and sort of think, this is an issue that will never get resolved. I will take the easier route and not speak on this and use, the talking points that will keep me safely in Congress, and not rock the boat on an issue that I can't win on. But I would say there's a large part that also needs education. There has been a narrative for a really long time in this country and around the world that has been shaped about the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause, that sort of dehumanized them, that's taken away people's ability to actually see them as individuals, as humans who feel, love, care, pray, eat, drink like we do, like any other human being. People who are deserving of joy, people who are deserving of humanity, people who are deserving of care and compassion. Oftentimes, when you bring up Palestinian, people, don't have a sense of a connection, a sense of understanding, a sense of care, and I think our job is also, as fighters for human rights and dignity for all people, is to remember that, right? That there is a lot of work that has been done to dehumanize certain people around the world, and to bring their humanity back into the conversation, and I think that ultimately changes the conversation. I think it was last year when we took to the House floor and spoke about Palestinians. I remember texting Rashida and saying, we're going to do this for an hour, and she was like, no one else is going to join us, like it's going to be embarrassing, and I said, if we say we're going to do it, I feel like others will stand with us, and there was more than a dozen people who came and spoke. I think it's also about being brave to take that first step, to say, it is okay for me to speak for people that others don't want me to speak for, and care about. And I think as someone who's Somali, who came to this country when Somalis were the most demonized, they still are. I remember trying to have those conversations with people, trying to connect with people, and ask them about their grandmother and telling them about my grandmother, and talking to them about their grandfather that they had reference for, and sort of connecting through that, or their overbearing father, which my father was, and trying to remind people, regardless of where we were born, where you grow up, that there is a commonalities that we often have as human beings with shared experiences, and it's important to just see the person and not focus on the politics and the situation. I think, oftentimes when people are fighting for their right to independence, for their right to dignity, for their right to exist, whether we're thinking about folks in Central and South America, or whether we were thinking about the Irish or others, that humanization oftentimes changes the conversation.
Do you think, I think we would both agree that the status quo in Israel-Palestine is unjust. Do you believe that the best answer is still an independent Palestinian state, or do you think we have reached a point perhaps where we should instead focus on the idea of one equal democratic state in all the territory that Israel controls?
That's an interesting question. Certainly there is a huge portion, both in Israel and in the Palestinian territories, that are speaking about what it means to have a one-state solution that guarantees the rights and dignity of all. I know that the only person with Palestinian heritage in Congress thinks that way as well. What I hope for and want, obviously, I believe that Palestinians deserve their own right to self-determination, but obviously I am not Palestinian, and I would never be in a position to speak for them. I'm also not Israeli, and I can't speak for them as well. But what I do believe is that the current status quo cannot continue, and the current status quo cannot continue to be supported, especially as escalations continue to happen with this right-wing government that is in charge right now in Israel, that continues to put forth policies that limit the movement and the ability for Palestinians to exist as full human beings.
You've taken a somewhat different view on the Russia-Ukraine war than many in Congress. You've been somewhat more skeptical of the idea of broad-based sanctions against Russia, and somewhat more skeptical about all of the weapon sales that the U.S. has sent to Ukraine. Now, as you know, many of the people who've taken those positions, supporting the sanctions and supporting the military aid, have done so in the name of human rights. They've said what Russia's doing is a terrible crime, and Ukraine should be supported in whatever way we can, because their national self-determination is being threatened. I'm curious how you square your more skeptical view about America's military and sanctions policy with your general position on human rights.
I mean, the Ukraine situation is unique, and this is a conversation I've been having with anti-war folks. When a country is invaded by another country, you oppose that to me is the anti-war position, and so I oppose the violation of the human rights of folks in Ukraine by Russia and its aggression and the war that they've partaken in. It's unfortunate that we find ourselves in this situation. I obviously am pained anytime I watch little children in the middle of war, because it brings bad memories of my childhood. I think the United States is right to provide support. I don't like the provocative rhetoric that is used. I don't like the fact that any of it could be seen as, this having to do with Russia, U.S. Policy, because at the end of the day, it is Russia that's invading a country. It is Russia that is causing the death and destruction of Ukrainians. And it is something I think that we collectively have to stand up against and support Ukrainians that are, fighting for their lives.
So you've also been a critic, and one of the rare, I would say, critics of U.S. sanctions policies in general, America's willingness to impose sanctions. There are cases, though, sometimes when it seems like the people who are suffering human rights abuses want sanctions. I mean, in retrospect, most people would say that the sanctions that the Congressional Black Caucus forced Ronald Reagan to accept, for instance, on South Africa, were something that America can be proud of. So how do you judge when a sanction is moral because maybe it's helping people who are being oppressed by a terrible regime, and when sanctions are immoral because they hurt innocent people and deprive them of medicines or other basic necessities?
Yeah, I mean, there are sanctions that sort of cause a blackout. We have sanctions that are essentially a blockade, whether it's Cuba or Venezuela or Iran. And those to me are inhumane. And, there are obviously sanctions that you can place that might cause change in the way in which those heads of government are engaging in their domestic policy. But I remember on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we had Secretary Albright, who came in, and I talked to her about sanctions. I talked to her about whether she thought they made any sense, and she said it's a tool we have in the toolbox. Oftentimes we don't have something to the effect of oftentimes we don't have success with them. Oftentimes they tend to hurt the people and the population of the country instead of hurting the government that is violating human rights. And so, to me, there is something wrong in the way in which we think about sanctions. A lot of people ask for it, when they come to advocate against a regime, but there is a challenge in trying to make sure a sanction you put on a head of government or his supporters, it's easy for them to find a way to get around it. And so you ultimately end up increasing the number of sanctions to capture as many people as you want. You end up sanctioning their banks, you end up sanctioning their ability to import and export. And then that is when the danger comes, right? That's when you ultimately start to impact their economy, and that impacts everyone. When you have your sanctions being responsible for the fact that a whole population can't have access to prescription drugs, then you're not fighting against human rights. You yourself are now violating the rights of those people to get medicine. And so I've always been a proponent of us getting rid of the muscle memory that says, just impose sanctions without critically thinking about its impact. And I've done that across the board, even with the stuff in Ukraine and in Russia, I've refused to support certain sanctions that the United States wanted to impose, because I know that the Russian people are not responsible for the war that their government is waging. And as we fight to protect the lives of Ukrainians, we can't put the lives of Russians at risk as well.
One of the votes you've taken that you received some criticism for a few years ago was a vote on the recognizing the Armenian genocide, where I think you voted present. You're one of a relatively small number of members who did that. Again, given, you've been talked about your focus on human rights, I'm curious if you can explain why you did that.
Well, I explained it at the time, and it was shocking to me at the time that people actually thought I didn't believe the Armenian genocide happened. For me, I oftentimes have a problem in participating in political theater. I just didn't want for the vote to be meaningless in that regard, because a lot of my colleagues were pushing that to get back at Trump. I wanted that vote to be taken in a time when it was about taking the vote and recognizing the Armenian genocide. So obviously, if that vote were to come, I would vote yes.
You talked earlier about how militarized American engagement with Africa and other parts of the world is, how much often the defense part overwhelms the diplomacy and the development part. And how much of that, honestly, do you think is the result of the influence that defense contractors and the kind of what Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex has in, so many of the people in administrations in both parties come out of institutions where they were being paid in some form or another from those institutions. A lot of members of Congress get money, or their districts get money from those defense contractors. How much of a role do you think that has in shaping U.S. foreign policy?
Are you asking if lobbyists
especially for defense
shaping American foreign policy? Yes, it has been a huge impact. I mean, it's whether it is, this is why we need to get money out of politics, whether it is folks who, themselves are supported by these contractors in their campaigns, whether it is, the manufacturing plants and the jobs that are in their districts that influence, whether it is these countries that want these weapons and their lobbyists influencing. I mean, it is one of the things that nobody is willing to really have an honest conversation about or touch. I remember I raised an objection to selling weapons to Saudi Arabia and Nigeria around human rights violations and the EAU. And, we had a briefing, and it was okay. But ultimately, these conversations ended up being about, like, we need to move forward because, like, politically and strategically, it is the thing to do. So right or wrong is suspended oftentimes in these conversations. We don't honestly engage in a debate. They'll find a way to make you sound like you're crazy if you object. And it's it also is not helpful, right? Like, we have a lot of the pundits who blindly support these actions on TV. So it's like circling the wagons, whether it's your colleagues that are saying you're naive, you're wrong on the topic, whether it is the whatever administration is there at the time, whether it is, you know, every news channel that's out there. It's a whole machine that supports and uplifts this idea that we should make as many weapons as possible and we should sell it to as many countries as we can, regardless of what it's being used for and who is being killed with.
When you think about
as
the
long
role,
as those countries are our allies.
right. When you think about the role that you want to play in American foreign policy, are there people who are your inspirations, people historically, or even people in the present day who kind of you look to as models for the role you'd like to play in the foreign policy debate?
One of my role models is still in Congress. Barbara Lee, Congresswoman Barbara Lee, obviously has been someone who hasn't been afraid to stand alone. And you know,
like when she voted against the 9/11 resolution.
Yeah, against the war in Afghanistan. Yeah, and I think it is admirable, and history has vindicated her.
We only have just time for maybe one more question, but you did mention, it does strike me that throughout American history, whether you go back to figures like W.E.B. Du Bois or Muhammad Ali, Andrew Young, that Black political figures in particular have been quite harshly punished when they have made fundamental critiques of U.S. foreign policy, and that there's this kind of expectation that maybe Black American politicians should restrict themselves to domestic affairs and leave that to the big boys and you know, to an overwhelmingly white foreign policy establishment. Do you think that it is harder for Black members of Congress to challenge American foreign policy and to play a role in that than white ones?
It is, and you know, I think in general, I mean, if you remember Martin Luther King's popularity most dipped after he started talking about the Vietnam War, and start critiquing the administration on their policy, on their foreign policy. So obviously there is a correlation between being, I think, Black and being you know, someone who is othered in some regards, because the reality is, like, we still it's sort of, there's always a necessity for those who see themselves as the owners or the rightful citizens of this country, to try to put those that they don't see as equal citizens in their place. So the second-class citizen trope has always followed everyone who's not white, who doesn't come from a particular faith, and I think it is important for us to push that, to test that, to you know, to take whatever, like, political hit that is out there, because we have to find a way to normalize our participation in the political discourse, regardless of whether it is foreign or domestic, because we are citizens of this country. You know, I pay taxes as much as the next person. And, you know, this country's domestic and foreign policy impacts me in the same way as it impacts every person who's living in our country. And so to say, you know, I don't know, it's just too hard, I don't want to do this, so I'm not going to participate, is to allow for there to be uniformity in the conversation, and I hate hierarchy. I hate uniformity, and I hate complicity, and so I don't like people being complacent, and so I will continue to find a way, whether it is problematic or not, to say my piece. I might get it wrong at times, but I think it is a fundamental American thing to dissent.
Well, I think I speak for many people on the call who are grateful for your willingness to challenge moral complacency, even when it's not easy. Thank you so much for being with us. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Take care, everybody.